Hopefully you can see all of the panelists in the room. My name is James Pope. I'm exec leader of Whole Education, which is a national network of values-aligned schools and trusts that works across the country. And welcome to our session on hybrid learning, what's working and what's next. An event that's been brought together by eduu.school, the flexible online platform, learning platform. eduu.school is the first of its kind collaboration between school and industry. It was mobilized during COVID, but it's been built upon 20 years of proven practice. And its aim is to engage all stakeholders, and it's about to go to scale nationally. So thank you to eduu.school for sponsoring this event. And thank you for the panelists who are here in front of me. I'll come to those in a second for introductions. Just a few housekeeping tips, tech issues. I think we're all well versed in the world of video calls these days, but if you do lose the connection, then just rejoin. If we lose the connection, there'll probably be a lot more panic, so hopefully we won't. And just to encourage you, we definitely want to hear from you, so just encourage you to use the chat room function to share your thoughts and ideas and to collaborate in the conversation that we're having. And throughout the event, there will be a series of poll questions that you can engage with, and that will give us some useful sort of feedback and prompts into the conversation. A quick bit of framing. We've got across the next hour and a half, we've got three sort of big high-level questions we're going to be responding to. The first one is, what does high quality education look like in a remote and virtual world for staff, for children, and for the wider community? The second one is, should hybrid teaching and learning form an integral part of our education offer into the future? And if so, why and how? And what might the benefits and barriers to that be? And our third one is, if we think about schools of the future, how might an embedded hybrid learning offer change our schools? The outcomes of this session, hopefully, will be a time for each of us to reflect upon the last 8 months, to consider the learning that we've had from the education system's response and reaction to a remote learning environment at scale, what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. Hopefully be an opportunity for you to collaborate and connect with other people in the room, in the chat room and in the chat function, to appreciatively inquire with them and with others about your experience of hybrid learning and to benchmark your offer. And to do a bit of strategic thinking stimulated by these brilliant education and EdTech industry experts in the room, and the opportunity to consider and plan your hybrid learning and next steps into the future. So let me just quickly come to the panel for some quick introductions. So I'm going to come to Chris first. Chris is Microsoft's Director of Education. Chris, could you give a quick wave and a brief intro to yourself, please?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Really pleased to be here. As that says, like I am the Director of Education at Microsoft in the UK, job I've just been doing for a couple of years, but I've worked at Microsoft for a long time, some time in education on the product side, and then lots of other things as well. So I've been part of the tech sector for more years than I care to count anymore.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your time. I'll introduce Joysy John, Education Advisor. Hi, Joysy.
Hi, I've been, for the last decade, I've been working in education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And most recently, I was the Director of Education at Nesta, which is a global innovation foundation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joysy, and thank you for your time this afternoon. Dr. Kristen Weatherby. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I am a researcher and consultant. I work with EdTech Impact, which is a platform for suppliers and schools to find technology, but I also work with a lot of other companies and organizations. And I was formerly at the OECD running their big survey of teachers, and at the UCL Institute of Education, and also at Microsoft in the US and UK.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kristen, for joining us this afternoon. And last but by no means least, Sir Mark Grundy.
Such a shock, James. Really good to meet everybody this afternoon. Hope you're all well. So I'm Sir Mark. I'm the Chief Exec of Shireland Collegiate Academy Trust. We run a mixed matter primary and secondary schools in the West Midlands.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's jump straight in So the first discussion we've got about 25-30 minutes for. So I'm going to open it up. So what does high quality education look like in a remote and virtual world for staff, children, and the wider community? And I think this is an opportunity for us to reflect on the last 8 months. You know, there's definitely a reaction to the initial lockdown, and you know, a huge amount of resource and energy has gone into going from one day children in schools and experiencing learning in schools over a course of a weekend. 3 days later, we've sort of geared up to delivering learning in the remote and digital space. And Chris, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What do you think we've learned? What have we taken away from this period of time?
I mean, there's no doubt that the last few months have probably been the most challenging that the sector's ever had to deal with, and it has been, you know, quite a remarkable ride to be part of and also to see take place. And I think just incredible, you know, thanks really to the educators who have been relentless in figuring out ways to keep children learning as a result of, you know, the pandemic and all of the challenges that that's brought along. No one will be surprised to hear that as a result, we've seen just an explosion in the use of technology. And clearly we see that quite directly at Microsoft, where our technology is being used in many schools in the UK and around the world. And we've absolutely seen technologies like Teams just explode beyond anything that we had seen previously as being part of education. But we've also then seen lots of other services come to life. And I think that tells us a little bit about some of how the sector has evolved. And certainly early on, we were getting lots of questions that were kind of, how does this work? What do I do? Where do I go? And as the period of sort of this hybrid education has expanded, we've seen many more questions around, you know, what's the best approach to get these kinds of outcomes with students? Actually, this tool I'm finding more useful for achieving these outcomes with students. And so overwhelmingly, I think that we've seen that the sector has been incredibly resilient and has found new ways to teach and to help not just educate children, but also try and keep them safe, think about the emotional and social requirements that students have had. That's been very, very difficult for many students across the age ranges. And then have also started to see some of the benefits that technology has, not just in enabling education to take place, but the fact that it's a little bit easier to collaborate and to share workload and to think about automating things, and kind of data becomes, you know, starts to come to life. And so I think we've seen that begin to surface as well as schools and teachers have got a bit more comfortable with how this stuff works. They've started to put it to use in different ways, and that started to light up some of the automation and the capabilities that impact on things like workload. But there's no doubt that we've seen incredible creativity and innovation from things like, yes, of course, delivering teachers using, you know, classes using video, a bit like we are now, but to using pre-record, whole class feedback, you know, marking using ink and voice, to things like running cookery classes over video, to using it as safe playground spaces for children to connect socially. So I think lots and lots of innovation of giving new ways of learning, as well as trying to continue the ways of learning and teaching that were happening prior to schools closing.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. And I think, you know, that the point about the thanks to all educators and people working, you know, within education and schools is one really well made. I mean, I think it's you know, the continuation of education in all of its forms over the course of the last 9 months has been just, you know, incredibly inspirational, actually, to see, you know, within the English and the UK education system. But of course, that's happening globally as well, which is the point you make. I'm sort of really interested in that notion of you know, sort of an exponential increase in both the use of the tools, but also then the creativity and innovation that goes with it. To start to really push what those tools can and can't do, and really focusing on that point about high quality education, because of course we can switch into an online world and we can deliver an education, but actually, you know, we really want it and desire it to be really high quality. And Joysy, if I perhaps come to you on that point, is your view on you know, the last 8 months, but perhaps particularly that point around sort of innovation and creativity.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the point that Chris made, that there's been a tremendous amount of effort from school leaders and teachers who've gone above and beyond their role in making sure that not only that the learning continues, but also helping students adjust with this new normal. where there have been concerns around their well-being or high levels of stress. So it's been phenomenal in terms of both the adoption of technology to make sure that children are learning, but also the role that teachers have played in ensuring that kids have food, or that they are engaged in their learning. So some of the things that we've seen over the last 8 months is that, kids from well-off families have had access to some of these creativity options and additional enrichment options, even though it's a lockdown. They've had tuition support, or they've had learning pods or opportunity where they get that support at home or via technology and the schools that are supporting these schools in independent schools. When it comes to kids in poor areas, they're not just going without food, but some of them don't even have access to devices or the internet. So there's been a huge challenge from that perspective when it comes to equity in education. So, what does high quality education look like? It's not just for 80% of the population, it's for everyone. So how do we ensure that those who are the most disadvantaged are getting the same high quality of education? And there's been lots of effort. There's been the provision of laptops, but as we know, there have been some challenges in getting those laptops to young people. But what has come to the fore is that there's been huge amount of creativity in terms of trying to find other ways of making sure that the learning continues, whether that is printing resources and getting it to kids, or having phone calls, or even some teachers visiting students to try and make sure that they're continuing with that learning. So some of the things that have stood out in terms of what does high quality education look like, one of the key things is learner agency and that motivation that comes with it, that they are excited and are willing to engage in the process. The second thing is around parental engagement. So, we know that parents play a huge role because a lot of the time kids spend is outside of the school. So how is that support being provided, and what sort of things can we do to make sure that parents are fully engaged and they are getting information around what kids are learning? And finally, it's around teacher training. So Mark, one of the pilots that we ran as part of eduu.school is providing that additional training required for teachers to adapt to the new reality and to use technology so that it benefits all learners.
Brilliant, thank you, Joyce. And I think a couple of things have really sort of stood out for me from what you said there. And I think the first one is this sense of, I think sometimes we can perceive technology as something which makes us further apart and it makes us less human. But actually, I think what you're touching on there is what the pandemic's created is a situation where technology is actually being used to bring us closer together. And I think one of the interesting impacts of the pandemic is actually, it's, in some schools are reporting a much stronger link to their community and a much stronger sort of community engagement, even though it's been harder to see people and harder to visit people. And it's that sense of maintaining that sort of social, and we'll pick this up later on, that sort of social sense of schools and schooling and what they add. But also recognizing that actually from a community point of view, in some regards, it's brought us closer together in a way we might not have expected. I think the second thing is we certainly saw across the whole education network this sense of technology as a barrier, or access to technology as a barrier. And we did this piece of work with Nesta. And it is certainly a barrier for some young people, and it's definitely upon us to make sure that we provide technology for those young people. But actually that notion of agency, they can have the technology in front of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've got the agency and the skills that they require to manage their learning still in that remote way. And I think that's a really key point. It's actually the two together need to be addressed. Actually, we can give children the technology, but we also need to make sure they have the agency to move their way through the learning is really key. Kristen, if I come to you, you might pick up on any one of those themes, or sort of continue just the sort of reflective view of the last 9 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Joysy really hit on the single most important issue with hybrid learning, or the learning over the lockdown, and that is equity to education. And it's not just an issue in this country, it's an issue all over the world. I'm working with the OECD on a project on distance learning right now, so I've been looking at what other countries did during the pandemic as well, and everybody had an issue with it, other than like South Korea, I think. So there's what I have been, other than that, which, I'm also a school governor, so I watched my little primary school and went to virtual governing board meetings where we looked at the pupils who never logged on through the entire lockdown. And I listened to the head teacher and the amount of times he tried to go by people's houses and everything and reach out. And it just actually breaks your heart when you think of the amount of learning. And, this is these children's one chance at an education, and it's being lost. So I think that's the biggest issue. I do a lot of work with teachers, and I've done a lot of research on teachers, and that I think is the next most important thing to look at. And because, as you said in your introduction, James, we did just kind of throw everybody into this. And distance learning and hybrid learning can be really successful if people are prepared. And it's not just about the technology skills, it's about teaching in a different way. So teachers have to do the same things they would normally do teaching. They have to encourage students to work in groups and peer learning, and they have to engage with parents, and they have to assess and provide formative feedback and all of this. But then they have to do extra things now that they're online. They have to learn extra skills and how to adapt their pedagogies to using them with technology. But then they also had to address during the pandemic, how to get eyes on children at the beginning of the day to make sure children that were at risk were going to be okay, and how to, make sure that they were dealing with children with special needs and how to accomplish that. So, I mean, I really always think teachers are heroes, but especially now. And every teacher in every school I've talked to recently, anywhere, just tells me how exhausted teachers are all around the world. And I just applaud them. But I think there's real, exciting possibilities for this kind of educational model in the future. And I'm already giving away my answer, I think, to a subsequent question. But if we can better prepare people for success.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kristen. And as you were talking, I was reminded of an analogy. I mean, I think education has always felt a little bit like rebuilding the plane whilst it's flying. In this last period, it feels like it's been rebuilding the plane whilst it's flying in outer space into uncharted territory. So, yeah, I think that's a really important point, because it's it's not just the impact on children, it's the impact on staff and the demand on staff, because everybody wants to get it right. Whatever that looks like, people want to get it right. They want to be successful, on behalf of their young people. Mark, a sort of view from sort of Shirelands and the ground, and you might touch on eduu.school in what you say, but what's your experience of the last 8 months been, and how do you think you've sort of tackled within your sort of region? How do you think you've tackled that issue of a high quality education?
James, I just wish I'd retired a year ago, because I think it would have been a much better decision. At the risk of this sounding twee, if you're on this call and you're watching this, it's because you're bothered, and you're probably brave, and you probably get technology. So for everything that you've done, thank you. I have no reason to do that, other than I just think this is a time when everybody should stick together. I think the negative bit in this is there's just not enough schools that are on things like this. There's not enough schools that we've got to be confident. There's not enough staff that think they haven't gone out on a limb doing what you've done to support youngsters, and that's got to change. And actually that won't change in the way that we've used for the last few years, because we've used quite a controlling structure and not an architectural and systemic structure. So there needs to be a bit of a revolution in this. Otherwise, to be honest, when something tragic happens again, we'll go and wonder why we didn't learn from this, and that would be really, really tragic. So I think the most impressive thing that I've seen over the last 8 months, James, is how differently people have behaved. And Kristen just touched on that, but what we're seeing is some practice we didn't see before. We've used Teams for a long time. We have a very strong Microsoft architecture across the Shireland schools. We built the eduu.school solution that Joysy and Nesta helped us support a whole group of youngsters with. But we've never used Teams the way we use Teams now. So we use paired Teams delivery. We do Teams events. We use it in terms of safeguarding in a very secure way. We run pastoral forums. We have more family engagement today than we've ever had. And I shouldn't be saying that, because it should have been our norm. And why have we used technology so strongly in Shireland? Because it's a very, very challenging community. Economically, it's one of the most, the schools that we serve are some of the most challenged in the country. They're the most culturally rich. I love them to bits, which is why this is my lots of years I've been there, not telling all of you. But they don't have the wherewithal to help their kids as well as they want to. So actually what technology has always been able to do for us at Shireland, James, is level a playing field. Yeah. I think the problem with the current playing field is there isn't one. There are lots of them, and some of them are pretty horrible. Yeah. And actually some of them change on an almost daily, weekly, sometimes hourly basis. I have a COVID hotline. I don't really, but it's how it feels. Sometimes every 10 minutes I get a call with great news. And we've all got this infection is it's not particularly discriminating anyway, is it? We've been through some really difficult times. The only thing that's kept our schools working well, our schools working together, our youngsters in touch with us, our youngsters feeling well supported, because I think when we went into this and the department gave out laptops, and they deserve lots of praise for doing that bit. So going and getting resource and getting laptops, great idea. Going into people like Chris and actually getting the support from Microsoft and Google and others, great idea. Having a plan as to what you're going to do with the laptops when you send them to schools, or not having a plan, less good idea. But actually what I think we've done is try to fill the gaps. As we come out of this and hybrid learning becomes an integral part of the way that we work, because James, I'll answer your second question in what we're doing now. Yeah. It has to be, if you want to level the playing field. We need to move away from the remote learning terminology, which I'm already getting, everybody's talking about, into much more about closing gaps learning and catch up learning and supporting individuals learning. I think the bit that there were lots of bits of the eduu.school pilot that Joysy and my team ran with Glue. But one of the bits that I think was most impressive is it wasn't just about academic delivery or GCSE delivery or a bit of national curriculum. It was actually about how we could support youngsters with their well-being and their confidence and their resilience and sleeping and talking to each other and feeling valued. And I think whatever process we put in and we learn from this, it needs to be much more holistic than it's been for quite a while. And James, it also needs to be much more architectural than it's been. Yeah. Heroic airdrops of laptops or of here's some money to give you a system, that's not sustainable. It needs to be an architectural, well thought through, trained and resourced. And I suppose the other bit, if you want hybrid learning, ministers have to value technology and they have to value working differently. I often, when I present, I'll show the fact that in lots of schools, you can put up that Victorian classroom slide. And actually, we've got lots of schools that look the same. They don't now, do they? They look very different. So whatever we should do, let's not lose that. Let's keep the blended. Let's never lose the focus on, high quality first teaching and really assessing, and not just assessing the things that are dead easy, or I think I can put into some fairly ill-conceived league table, but actually, how do we assess what kids are good at so they can be better and feel great about moving forward? And I think hybrid learning for me is something that looks after the youngster in the most holistic way, actually works to their skills and develops them. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we don't focus on knowledge, we absolutely do. But in the same way that I think there's more of a discussion now about that balance between skills and attitudes and knowledge because of an inspection framework, wouldn't it be great actually if the Department for Education pushed, look, there's a different way of working that we get now that we really want to see happen. This is how our difference is going to be. And some form of hybrid, different way of working. If we lose that, James, I think we're daft, because we've gone through a lot of pain to get here.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that sort of being thrown into this reactive space. And I guess for a lot of schools, many schools, but maybe many not, actually still feeling as they're still very in that reactive space, or trying to cling on to the back of the aeroplane as it's flying through outer space and being rebuilt. And I think, your call to arms there is very much, can we get back into this sort of proactive architectural? But I'm also struck, I think what you're saying is that in many respects, we've seen everything change in the last 8 months, but actually in reality, nothing's changed. The principles of what we're trying to achieve are still the same. We want equity of access to education for all young children to be as good as it should be. But I think we're perhaps grappling with that notion that the spectrums that we always experience in education, and you can apply sort of spectrums in any sort of way, but that the spectrum of experience of access, the equity that we see, they've all been blown apart. They've become much bigger and much broader. And I suppose the architectural bit is, can we reshape them and end up with something better and a tighter spectrum, so there is less variation in the experience that children have when they're accessing education, depending on where they are in the country. Before we move on to the next section, is there anything else that anybody like to add on that, experience of the last 9 months, that sort of very reflective space about high quality education? Anything that anybody would like to respond to from anything that anybody else has said? I'll take that as a no. Right, we're going to go into the votes. I'm going to ask the question of you. I think I know what the answer is already. 2 of you have given it away. Should hybrid teaching and learning form an integral part of our education offer into the future? And hopefully that is going to appear as a poll for those of you that are watching. So should hybrid teaching and learning form an integral part of education offer into the future? I'm just going to quickly go around. I'm going to quickly go around the room. And Joyce, I'm coming to you first. Is it a yes or a no for you?
Yes.
It's a yes. Kristen, I think we know your answer.
Yes, indeed.
It's a yes. And Mark, I think we know yours.
Yes for me.
Yes. And Chris, I'll come to you last.
It would be really surprising if I said no now.
It would
kind of, yeah, I feel, yeah, of course I'm going to say yes.
And hopefully we'll get the poll results sometime shortly. So I suppose what the next question are a series of questions, and I'll come to each of you in turn, but I suppose we've partly answered the why, but feel free to expand on that in any way. So why should it? If the answer is yes, why should it? And then perhaps touch upon a little bit on the how. And what you think, we touched on benefits already, but what you think the sort of benefits and barriers might be, and we might be able to sort of hone in on some of those things. So sort of why, how, and what are the benefits and barriers? And Joysy, I'm going to come to you first on that one, which gives everybody else much more thinking time. Apologies, Joysy.
So I think we know that hybrid learning is going to be a key part of learning going forward. So if you think about how education system has had to adapt over the last few months, we know that technology can play a crucial role, but it's not purely driven by technology. I think teachers play a crucial role and parents play a crucial role. So going forward, if we can embed hybrid learning into the experience of a learner when we're fully out of the lockdown and everyone is back in school, I think it helps, first of all, from a personalization standpoint, right? Kids can go at their own pace. They can learn and really build upon their learning. Those who need to go a bit slower and understand a topic a bit more can get that additional support. So it doesn't force everyone to be at the same level or progress at the same level, right? It gives that extra support. I think the second thing is around the benefits, right? We know that teachers are overworked. And if, as a teacher, you don't have to manually mark everything, manually prepare everything, but if technology can help make your life easier by giving you a few extra hours back, then that's a benefit that we want to hold on to in the long run. And the final thing is around how it's a crucial element, not just of building the skills that are needed in learners, but also how the world has evolved and changed. So if we can build that into the learning environment where kids are already accustomed to this technology that eventually they'll have to use when they go into the workplace. So from those perspectives, I think the why is very clear. Why do we need hybrid learning? How should we make it happen? I think investments in infrastructure, making sure that the access to devices and connectivity is there. Investment in teacher training, so making sure that teachers know how best to use technology and how to support the learners on that journey. And finally, it's around rich analytics. So, if technology can help with understanding where the gaps are, who needs the most support, then it just makes the teacher's life a lot more easier. So I think those are the key elements to make the how of hybrid learning happen. Brilliant.
Thank you, Joysy. And you touched on the sort of social emotional side earlier on, but is that do you think that helps? Is hybrid learning going to sort of really support children in a way that perhaps we've not been able to do before? Because the danger is, we operate in the English education system. It's been quite reductive for the last 10 years. And Mark's already sort of put out a rallying cry for this more holistic view of education, which we at Whole Education definitely, we stand firmly on that platform. So talk to us a little bit about the sort of social, emotional, and how hybrid learning could be useful in that space.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges when it comes to social and emotional learning is the ability to measure things, because in education we want to show progress, right? We want to be able to measure and say, yes, somebody has improved, and it's easier to do in English and maths and a lot harder to do. It is still doable, but slightly in a different way. So there's a lot of evidence that social and emotional skills determine how well people adjust to their environment, how much they achieve in their lives, in their work, in their community. And having the skills to be able to self-regulate, to be able to communicate, to work with others, the so-called social skills, the so-called skills around creativity, critical thinking, these are extremely important, but somehow with a very narrow curriculum, we've managed to drive that out from the education system. So the more focus that we can bring on these essential skills around how kids are feeling, because if you're feeling low, if you're feeling under threat, and if you're feeling uncertain about the future, then your motivation to learn will be very low. If you're feeling that you're struggling and there's no hope given where you live or because of your race or gender or whatever background or challenges that you're facing as a young person. So I think having those conversations to really understand the context, not just delivering the content, because a lot of education or the traditional education is about just the content delivery. And as Mark said earlier, it is about the combination of the two. You want to be able to deliver the content, but then help learners apply that in their lives and in their community. I think the other thing to mention is when parents are stressed because of the economic uncertainty and because of the fear of would they be able to provide for their family, that has an impact on the young person. When teachers are stressed because of the high workload, that has an impact on the young person. So I think it's not just about the social and emotional skills of the learner, it's also about the teacher as well as the parent, and we need to start thinking about it in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, I think that's lovely, Joysy, and it's about creating that environment where people can thrive and flourish. And you've really made me think about, actually, when we use the term hybrid, that there is a tendency in the English education system, I think in particular, to have these sort of polarized views and this sort of binary view. And actually, we think we're talking about hybrid learning in the sense of school and outside of school and digital, but actually the sense of the hybrid being applied to the content knowledge and the skills and quality. That's a really nice way of looking as well. So when hybrid becomes a term that describes all of what we would like to achieve, in the sense of actually it's a balance of those things. It's neither one nor the other. I think that's a really lovely thing. I think as you were chatting, I think we got the vote results in, and of the, I think it was 90 people who voted, we have got 99% said yes, 74 votes. There was one no, there was a no. So hopefully whoever that person is in the room, we will be able to change their view or provoke a different sort of view from them over the course of the next sort of 45 minutes or so. There were 15 people who didn't answer. I'm not quite sure what that means. I might say something about technology as well, but okay. So if we know the room generally is all in the frame of this is a good idea. Kristen, I'll come to you next, and I think you might pick up on some of the points around sort of the why and the how and the benefits and barriers, but perhaps specifically around actually how will we know if we've been impactful?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I'll say, I was reading this book today for this report that I'm writing for the OECD, and the authors defined hybrid learning as basically taking the best bits from traditional face-to-face learning and online learning. And so I really like that because it doesn't really necessarily need to disrupt the whole system. We can still keep a lot of the structures of teaching and learning that we're all familiar with, that parents are familiar with, and politicians are familiar with. So nobody needs to get their feathers ruffled, but we can just kind of take the best parts and put them together. So I thought that was a quite interesting definition. The other thing that I would mention is, in doing kind of this research around the world as to how countries handled the pandemic, is in other countries, there's a far greater disparity between technology haves and have-nots, and yet largely everybody has access to radio and television. And a lot of countries made fantastic use, and this is developed and developing countries alike, made fantastic use of television programs, whether that be lectures from teachers, or, for example, in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the government enabled teachers to have access to an app on their phones where they could produce video that was then distributed to their learners to access on their phones. And the government had made an agreement with telecommunications industry to provide free data. So there's so many different levels of possibilities for success with hybrid learning if we have kind of everybody working together, creating content, providing infrastructure, that kind of thing. And there's so much research saying that it's really can be really successful, and in terms of improving student learning and motivation, but also in terms of reach. So think about all the students who are ill and have had to self-isolate at home and have still had access to their learning, or students who are long-term ill in hospital can still have access to their classmates and learning. Students who attend rural schools and don't have access to certain classes that might be offered at the school in the big city, and they can have access to those classes, or specialist teachers, or tours of the Louvre or whatever. And it's the possibilities are really quite exciting. But yes, we have to figure out what works. And my son goes to a school that has been a Microsoft partner. This is like the Microsoft show here at this. Sorry to keep saying Microsoft, but
Chris is happy.
Yeah, but it's funny because I read this article recently about changing education is like turning an oil tanker, because it just takes forever, and by the time you've turned it, you might be going the wrong direction. But I was really impressed with how agile schools have been, and I felt like every week I was getting a new email from the head teacher that said, okay, we've tried this variety of asynchronous learning and this variety of providing synchronous learning, and now we've realized that this mix doesn't quite work, so we're going to try something else this week. So the school was really clued into, first of all, what the research says about blended learning, in terms of providing synchronous video and chat and live teaching, but then also being able to provide asynchronous video and resources and self-paced learning for students, and how that's beneficial as well. And then they adapted based on the data and evidence that they were collecting of what worked and what didn't work in their own classes. And this is the bit, as excited as I am that so much more technology is being used by teachers in schools, and maybe they're less afraid of it and less reluctant. As excited as I am, I wonder how many teachers and schools looked in, the chaos of lockdown and now look to see, okay, this is what I used. This is why I think it worked. This is the evidence I have to back it up. So, I know nobody has any extra time right now, but one of the things I recommended on a little video I did for the Chartered College of Teachers is that, teachers often ask students to keep a journal of their learning to kind of help regulate their own learning and understand when they're making progress and not. And if teachers were able to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the end of every day, at the end of every week, and say, okay, this is what I did this week with this particular product or this particular practice with technology. This is what worked. This is what didn't. This is what I would do differently. These are the types of kids that it worked for. These are the types of kids that it just didn't work for. And, by the end of a term, you have so much evidence for your own teaching, but also to share with colleagues and ultimately, so much tech was given away for free during lockdown. That's not going to be free forever. And when schools are making purchasing decisions, how are they going to know what worked?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think there's sort of several really interesting bits in there for me. I mean, I really like that sort of broader view of technology, beyond, perhaps certainly what many of us may think of, computers and phones and iPads, but actually the broader use of the media, but actually, the realization that all of those things are just, and I think Mark may pick up on this point, all of those things ultimately are just, they're just tools. And ultimately, you still got to make sure that there's quality in the content and the production of that content was a really striking point for me. And I think what's also really interesting is this. Mark used the word architecture earlier on, and I think what's really interesting is that the recognition that actually there's loads of really good stuff going on, and there's always been loads of really good stuff going on in education, but certainly in the UK system, there's sort of the negative rhetoric around development and change to improve things, and yes, that needs to be done, but there's also an awful lot of stuff that's really good. And actually this notion of change with purpose to make things different rather than just change, and I think that identification of there needs to be, we've been given a purpose. There's a massive burning platform of the pandemic that created a real purpose for everybody, and there was a real sort of collaboration around that, and not losing sight of that actually there is a purpose and intent and architecture in what we do and why we go about doing. But that reflective piece then about how do you know, and I love that idea of keeping a journal, again, really simple, what worked for who. So there's this notion of teachers as developing their practice in this very research sort of focused way. I really love that idea. I think there's probably a few strands on there, Mark, that you could pick up on within that sort of broader context of why and how and benefits and barriers.
So James, I think there's loads of hows and there's loads of things we should do, but let me pick 4. So. Yeah. We need to think differently about how we support the delivery of learning experiences to youngsters, because it's 2020, nearly 2021, and we have school-based staff who spend Sunday afternoon trawling through the internet to find something for the next week that's going to inspire the kids, and that's as well as we can do. Come on, that's really not on. And one of the problems, you'll hear lots of rallying cries from me, James. I feel like I'm running out of time as I approach retirement, so I get worse. I know I do, and I'm sure I never used to have as many soapboxes as I have now. I have my own sort of little supply over here. We need to own the curriculum. Yeah. We need to own those experiences, but we need to do a better job of heavy lifting for school staff and for youngsters and for families. We own the curriculum. We're dominated by discussions about EBAC and phonics and T-levels. That isn't what we should be talking about. So this needs to change that. Need to train staff better, much better. And we also need to do more work on change management, because that's what this is about. You can't just throw some training, and with the greatest respect, it needs to be contextualized, and some people from school need to be doing it. So for us to think we can outsource it to third parties who don't understand how year 6 work, year 13 work, year 9 work is naive. So I'm not saying all teachers should do the training. That would add a massive burden to staff. I don't want to do that. But I equally don't want to outsource it to people who don't get what I need. Because in this is technology should allow me to do a better job in a more personal way. It should never diminish my role as a professional. It should just enhance it. This nonsense I read sometimes, and I've been reading the comments from everybody, and I know we're preaching to the converted. So we're not trying to replace staff. We're just trying to help them have a life. That's sort of what we try and do. We need to support youngsters better with their resilience. So in the how of this, if we only think about academic subjects, I thought it was very interesting. Some of the solutions we saw went for the low-hanging fruit of subjects. So if it was very knowledge rich and it was very linear and it was very concrete, we tried to do something about it. But if it was an art or a design, or it was interactive, or it needed to be thought of differently, we no, and we need to be better than that. And the same way, we need to be better than that with assessment, because if we're going to keep measuring stuff that's dead easy to measure, I don't know why we're bothering. So let's get more into analytics. Let's harness things like Power BI and different and AI, but let's not do them in a sort of circus performance way. Let's do it in a mundanely clever, integral, making a massive difference to our workforce and our kids way. So build 2 things. Build a different curriculum that is much more relevant for young people, because actually, what's the field of dreams then? If you build it and it's, they'll come. I wouldn't come. If I had to do the EBAC at the moment, I wouldn't do it. I wasn't great at behaving. And Chris knows me quite, I'm not very good at behaving now. I just would opt out. The honest reality is we have a lot of young people who are opting out of Key Stage 4 because they feel it's being done to them, not for them. And then secondly, build an architecture. I do quite a lot of work for the department. I have to be really careful. I'm also our biggest critic, because we threw technologies that could be class-based without thinking that actually, if you had 40 classes and they all used a class-based solution differently, you would actually add a pressure to the school. You wouldn't add a coherence to the school. So again, come back to an architecture. James, the work that we've been doing with Hodder is really interesting, because, and this isn't to sell Hodder, this is to sell why I think it's been different, which is we've gone to look at things that youngsters can learn with, and we can help them to learn better. We've put together a jigsaw of resources within this next iteration of EdUSchool. And then we're going back to staff and saying, we've over-engineered this, pick the bits you want, but we've actually got a lot of stuff for you. That means you don't have to go and find it. You haven't got to forage for this, and change it, make it slightly different, make it right for your youngsters. We desperately need to find a mechanism in school using technology and using the wealth of ability that we've got in school staff to do that together, not separately. So the how for me is there are some structural things as ever. There always will be. I've rarely seen anyone be creative without there being order. But then also, excuse me, recognize that this is not easy, but scaffold structures to help staff to do it.
And Mark, I think if I've interpreted what you said correctly, I think one of the things that just sort of stood out to me is this notion of actually professional agency. We talk about student and young person's agency, but actually, I think a part of what I think you used the phrase, being done to for children, and I think there's a sense certainly in the UK system that education, some of the agency that we may have had as professionals has been taken away from us over the course of the last decade, and that notion of actually crafting the curriculum and taking ownership for that back, but also being the agents of learning, and having control and agency over that ourselves, enables us out of that sense of order to be more creative, because we're coming from a secure platform. And you know, I think that's really exciting, because then you get into really rich CPD and development of staff. You know, with that notion of actually I'm in control of this, and I'm making some decisions with, you know, using my own professional experiences. Chris, I'm gonna come to you next to sort of pick up on perhaps some of the points that have been made by other people in the room. But I think particularly you're interested in sort of the use of technology around workload and well-being and this notion of, you know, how we can do data better, which I think is touching on some of the things that other people have said, but yeah, I think you might go a bit deeper on. Yeah,
I think first of all, lots of great comments from everyone in the panel, and I'll try not to repeat them, even though there's lots of things that I would have talked about and vehemently agree with. I mean, I really liked Kristen's description of hybrid as sort of the best of all of your options, and I think like implicit in that statement is this is not about it being only technology. And I think a lot of people react to this as going like, why do I want to sit and stare at a screen all day? And it's like, the answer to that is you absolutely don't. You want to think about using the screen and the technology in all of its forms, not just a laptop, to enhance and give you new options for learning and expand that learning opportunity, rather than it just being like, well, that's the default option. And so I think that was a really nice description. I think we've also seen some of the comments in the chat that are around, you know, that there are lots of constraints that we're facing right now that are making this much harder. And hopefully, as we think about the future, we'll have much greater flexibility over location. You know, much of what we've had to face has been because we've been all forced to be at home or be much more restricted, and that's had, you know, knock-on consequences in all sorts of ways. You know, we hopefully will be, you know, not too far away from having a hybrid learning environment where we have much greater flexibility about delivering these things in school, out of school, at home, in other locations. And so I think that will give us much greater opportunity to think about bringing that best of all of the worlds. I think the only thing that I'll add in addition, you know, typically when we talk about this, and of course in 2019 we never talked about remote learning. It just wasn't really a thing. You know, it was only a kind of a niche thing, if you like, for particular kind of virtual schools and particular environments or individual cases. It became the dominant conversation for a lot of 2020. But in 2019, what we talked about in terms of the value of technology, I often talked about the value to teaching and learning, and lots of people have talked about lots of benefits of how, you know, that lights up and I would particularly add in the opportunity to make learning more accessible and give students particularly the opportunity to interact with content in the way that works for them without necessarily showing anybody else that they maybe need a little bit of extra help in a particular area. We also then talk about the benefit that technology has for staff, and particularly I think that's around workload. And it's, you know, to me, visiting schools and talking to teachers in lots of different environments, you know, I've spoken to so many members of staff who have looked at leaving their school where they're, you know, heavily adopted in technology to go to somewhere that hasn't made that journey, and they're unwilling to go because they've kind of been in that environment, they've seen the benefit of using tech well, and they're not willing to go back because they know the impact that has on their overall work-life balance and their ability to have impact with their students. So they're not willing to change again. So I think that's another, you know, group that really gets benefit from using technology. And then the last one that I don't think we've talked about particularly is the school itself, like the people running the school and the organization. And I think that is a lot about data, and Mark talked a little bit about that. But overall, as more and more of education gets digitized and gets turned into data, the opportunity for us to bring that data together to tell us, you know, interesting things about what's happening in the school, in particular in subjects, or even in a particular pupil situation, and then increasingly the role that AI will play in starting to be able to predict maybe what will happen next. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us to start personalizing learning, targeting interventions, and automating workload and process for lots of different people. You know, one of the things that I'm really looking forward to is a time when no teacher has to do a predicted grade for anybody, because there's enough interactions across the system that says, like, we think it's going to be this, and it's probably going to be better than the teacher at getting that there or thereabouts. And so, you know, lots of these sorts of processes today take up a huge amount of time without really adding a ton of value. I want to try and automate as much of those. And I think we're still some way from that being completely pervasive, but as things get digitized across the sector and in individual schools and interactions, those sorts of things become much more possible and practical benefits of going down this way. And so that's, you know, and I think everybody else has sort of touched on all of the other topics, and perhaps, you know, the last thing to add would be, you know, I think the opportunity to bring expertise and resources that are not in your school to your school. I think that's really exciting. And yesterday I took part in our Global Learning Connection, and I visited a school in Scotland and had a lovely time meeting the students there. And I am now on the hook to have an elephant on work experience, which I think is going to be fun. But you also see some really cool examples of that, where people do mystery calls. They talk to a school in another country and they have to figure out where they are. Get to know them a little bit and have some of these experiences that many people just don't get to have. And I think that sort of idea of bringing different resources, different expertise, will Joe Wicks run PE forever? Maybe. There's probably lots of teachers that would be quite grateful for Joe Wicks running PE, but that kind of expertise being run remotely and brought into school, I think is a really interesting part that perhaps hasn't always been fully explored as well.
Yeah, and sort of what I'm thinking off the back of that, Chris, is this notion of I sometimes think we expect so much of our teachers. We expect them to wear several, if not several hundred different hats. And I'm getting a sense from what you're saying is that ultimately this is an opportunity perhaps to free teachers up to be teachers, but in the process of doing so, to be quite intentional and about how we define that role. And actually, what is the most important thing that our teachers do in our schools on behalf of our children? And we might pick that up in the next section a little bit. I was going to sort of come back and off the back of what people have said, a sort of additional question. I was in a school on Monday and reflecting with the head teacher at that school about their experience of lockdown and remote learning. It's a primary school, really successful primary school. And there was a talk about gaps and the gaps had opened up, and we've touched on that already, and actually just high quality teaching and learning. So we touched on all of those things. The one thing she said that they've noticed is because one of the things that could be done at home really straightforwardly, and what parents in their community could manage to help their children with, was reading in the primary, and basically they've seen the reading ages just leap. So I sort of come back to the question about, we talk about hybrid, and I think we've made this point several times. There's a danger that it ends up being positioned in one place, and I think it's about that flexibility of thinking around, well, actually, what's better done remotely or digitally or separately. So rather than say all learning can be done out there, or in that sense, actually, are there specific bits of it that will be better? Their experience was reading. They really struggled to get give parents the resources and the skills to tackle the whole of the curriculum. Many parents gave it their best shot, but actually what they could do, and of course the volume of children's reading went up exponentially, and unsurprisingly their ability to read. Now obviously that's massively beneficial. We talk about reading and reading ages all of the time, but I wonder if anybody else has had experience of that, where that they've seen something happen really, really successfully in the remote space. And then a second question for that, is there a little bit of an uncomfortable truth here that actually for some of our children, learning in the remote digital hybrid outside of school environment was actually a better experience? And I'll sort of, Mark, I'm going to come to you. You just, a wry smile has just crept across your face, so I'm going to come to you first.
I think a bit like Joe's, we've said lots of times, in the end, you want the best of all bits with this.
Yeah.
I think that there have been some youngsters for whom actually remote learning has been really good, but only with the right wraparound around it.
Yeah.
And in a measured way. I think the schools who use technology well are selective. But then it's the same probably about all sorts of aspects of everyday life. If you overdo it and you abuse it and it becomes boring, it doesn't have the same, it's not sticky. And I think we've seen some really interesting things. What would I take and not want to lose from COVID? Will never work in terms of our safeguarding teams the way that we did previously in relation to what we do now. So we have used Teams to have families engage with key professionals. We've run meetings. We've absolutely seen that some families and some children have opened up about issues either to do with their resilience, their coping, their ability to understand things over Teams better than they ever did in a face-to-face discussion. So I don't want to lose that. We've always run study support. We have a massive push on study support. So we've done all sorts of things after school across all of our MAT. We do things at weekends, we do things in half terms. And actually the kids rocked up in the summer and said, you're not going to run all those things again, are you, when we come out of COVID? Because they're boring. And actually, we'd rather be at home and do it, sir. And well, not just to me, to across all my beds of school. Almost without exception, both primary and secondary age children said a lot of what we do as wraparound to actually further develop skills and to give us better experiences. Actually, I'd rather do it at home, or with a cup of tea, or with my mum. So why do you make me stay from 3:30 until 5 o'clock and sit in a cold classroom that isn't my classroom, but you've made me find where only 50% of the youngsters of my class will stay. So I know very well it's going to compromise what's going to happen the next time we're together. Why can't we do it differently? So some engagement with families and specific cohorts, James, I want to keep. A different view of actually how we do study support and some enrichment activities, I want to keep. Teams have served us very well for a long time anyway, so I've always wanted to keep that. You know, why would you drag people to a meeting if they can do this and it can be almost as effective, where you make people sit in the car for an hour in the morning at a stupid time and leave their family at an even more stupid time, and we think that's clever? No, we're not going back to that. That's a nonsense. But equally, I miss seeing people really. I miss seeing them, you know, and so do the kids. So it is back to where this started, which is, you know, you can call it hybrid, you can call it blended, you can call it making the best of, I don't care what you call it, so long as whatever we do, there's a balanced part of what we do.
Yeah, I think that is coming through loud and clear. I think that notion of balance, we do have a tendency to swing from one side of the ship.
Yeah, and sorry, before I go, one of the things that we've also seen is that element of agency for youngsters to claim that they've achieved something. And actually, we've managed to use technology to do that better than I think we did before. Yeah. So youngsters actually saying, "Sir, I get it," or "Miss, I get it," and this is the bit of evidence. And I think that that evidencing of achievement in the chat part, there's a lot of comments about assessment, and that's because we still look at it from that lens of not trusting our staff. Yeah, so trust the staff, but equally staff trust the kids, because if you give them an opportunity to show their best, they don't show you their worst. They show you their worst when you put them in a position where they think it's puerile or boring, and I would be the same. Yeah, I'd be just as bad. So we've definitely watched this time allow youngsters to evidence achievement better than I think in some ways we did before. And then you stick your analytics in the background, because again, the thought of having somebody who has to count things, or Chris, with respect, stick it into an Excel spreadsheet and run, you know, all sorts of conditional formatting, that's a nonsense. Senior leaders should be presented with something that's simple, that's infographics based, that actually tells them what they need to know, so they can do a great job, which they could do in an even greater way if we freed them from some of the boring stuff. So
part of that architectural structuring, Mark, needs to be, you know, at a really system level. I mean, assessment, there's a lot to talk about assessment, you know, and where assessment goes both this year and next year, but to create that environment where we can get back to a trust of judgment in our young people and indeed our staff about that reflection. And as you're talking, you know, I'm minded of and reminded of Ron Berger's Austin's butterfly. You know, if we give children the opportunity to create something, they will iterate it and iterate it and iterate it until it's really good. But we need to provide those opportunities to do that. And perhaps the hybrid world is a place. And you've really struck home with the notion of efficiencies, of just, you know, simple efficiencies. So today I was in Leicester, I was in Wigan, and then I was in Essex, and those are 3 meetings that I've had today that in more normal times I've had to drive to. I don't even know, can't even begin to sort of sum up how much time that saved me. So that's really struck home with me. Anybody else want to respond to the, you know, the sort of that sort of provocation around, you know, have you come across examples of where some children's experience has been better, and how has it been better? Chris, if you are trying to,
I'm trying to talk, and I keep missing the button apparently. So, I mean, not specifically on student. I think Mark's talked nicely there. I think he made me think of a couple of other elements, and actually on the point of data, I couldn't agree more. And actually there was a comment in the chat around, data is great, but not everybody knows how to use it. And of course, that's not people's specialism. And so the more digestible and easier and translatable you make that without kind of having people to try and be statisticians. I think that there are a couple of things that I think have worked well in certain circumstances that I've heard a few times. One related to Mark's point, but definitely about staff communication within a school, like the idea that you don't actually all have to be here physically at this time to have a staff meeting, and that can be done in different formats, and communication across the school can be a bit more like it is in large companies, actually, where you access it in different ways from where you want to be, and that can be quite transformational in terms of the work-life balance that the staff experience. And then the other one I've heard a few times over the last few days, actually, is around the benefits that parents are getting by work always being shared through a platform like Teams, like the transparency that they are seeing as a result. Like, actually, I know what my children are now up to. I know what they're supposed to be learning, and then I actually beginning to get a sense of like how I help. Yeah. And of course, this is not universal, and I do think that we've touched a few times on the issues around disadvantaged children and families and the gap that this can create, but they, a lot of the time parents would like to help, they're just not always sure how. And that transparency of what they're doing, how they're doing it, and just that kind of communication gap with parents, I think, is also one of the benefits that we've seen that I hope sticks around. And I think parents will actually start to demand, actually, I don't want to stop knowing what my children are doing and how I get involved a little bit more deeply with their education.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Chris. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us into the final section where we can get properly creative. And I was sort of mindful when I was writing this question, Chris, you look far too young to remember this, but I remember back in 2020, the year 2000, back in 2020, it does feel like a while ago that, the year 2000, I was in my school, I was a wet behind the ears, 4 years in teacher, but I was given the responsibility of leading on Microsoft's Anytime, Anywhere learning. That was 20 years ago, 2 decades ago. And, I sometimes wonder, we've come a long way in many respects, but how far have we come? And this picks up on Mark's point about, you can still walk into some schools and still see that echo of the past. But if I project us forwards 20 years, 2000 doesn't seem that long ago to me. I'm of that age where it seemed like yesterday. It's 20 years ago. Let's project forward 20 years. It's the year 2040. With the burning platform and the pandemic of COVID-19 is, and the people in the room have all been energized by the things that have been discussed, and things are very, very different and have clearly taken hold and had an impact. What does it start to look like? And where does it take us? Does it take us to a much more sort of fluid notion of what education is? And sometimes I think we don't ask that question enough. What is education? And what's it for at a really high level? So an opportunity, the schools of the future. So how might an embedded hybrid learning offer change our schools? And Kristen, I'm coming to you first for this one.
Okay, and first, James, I have to tell you that I was at Microsoft in education when the Anytime Any Learning thing was. So thank you.
Well, you definitely don't look old enough for that.
Yeah. But I thought about this question, and it reminded me of some work that I had done when I was at UCL, at the Institute of Education, working with schools to help them kind of select and evaluate technology. Because one of the first things we did with schools was say, all right, let's look at what your needs are in terms of education, and what does your school improvement plan look like, and all that, and which ones of those needs are actually mapped to tech. Yeah. Like which of those problems can tech solve? And so I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting, exciting tech. I have put the virtual reality headsets on. I have seen startups that have, I've been able to land on the moon. I've seen startups that have let me do surgery on people, which is, ill-advised. And so that kind of stuff is really exciting and fantastic. But tech does not solve every problem. Yeah, so totally. When I think about primary school in particular, because I'm governor of a primary school, and even though that's not my teaching experience, I learn something there every time I'm there. And one of the things that I always think about, that's one of the most important things you learn in primary school, is how to be a person. So you learn, how to share, and how to have disagreements and resolve them, and how to play well with others, and be polite, and all those things that you And, you know, the other, not to mention the fact that primary school age children are not really great at self-regulating their own learning and sitting with a piece of tech, and unless it's a, you know, game. And maybe that's the answer. But there are certain things that will not be solved by tech. So I can see, you know, a lot of, you know, what we see as traditional education, classroom-based education happening. One of the things that I think is, you know, kind of old news now, but probably not used enough, is this idea of a kind of a flipped classroom, where the learning happens, you know, in a self-paced way at home. Lectures are delivered, so to speak, on video. Students can consume kind of the content, so they have this content knowledge. And then when they're in school with peers, they can work together on projects that, you know, solve real world problems. They can get support from teachers. The teacher's role, I think, will have to change a bit. So that, you know, maybe it's not as much of, which still happens a lot, not as much of up in front of the class, you know, talking, and more of this kind of scaffolding, supporting, guiding, which I would really love to see.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kristen. That's resonating a lot with me, especially somebody who had a 5-year-old at home during lockdown, whose ability to self-regulate any kind of learning with two parents who between them have 50 years of teaching experience was comedy, to say the least. Mark, I'm coming to you next. You know, what do you see in that future retirement, perhaps, when you're relaxing somewhere? What do you vision for sort of a future structuring of schools? Does it change or does it not?
I've got three answers. The first one is I've retired, so I simply don't care. I don't really mean that. I think the second answer, and it's equally glib, is no change. Because actually, if we had no change from the time of Queen Victoria to not many years ago, and in some cases where we are today, then why would I be so naive to think that actually in 20 years' time, I might even have grandchildren then, though actually with both my lads, I think that's probably a scary prospect. So, but then my more optimistic answer is, we will work in a different way. Yeah. I think, you know, Hodder are hosting this. James, I think publishers will work in a different way. They will think from a more resource flipped, to pick up Kristen's, you know, we've been working in a flipped way for over a decade. It's one of the things that's driven the change in my school, in our schools, because people have really, they get it. I think you need to strip away the mystique of technology. You know, and a lot of the vendors have loved to rap how hard it is to do, and that needs to go, and they need to be punished for doing that. And I don't quite know how I'm going to do that, but I'm sure I'll find a way. But we need to make this much easier to use, much easier to build your confidence. But I do think potentially in 20 years' time, ministers will have woken up and realised that a forced curriculum doesn't make a productive economy, because it doesn't make a productive experience. So perhaps in my naive retirement optimism, James, is that it'll be a much more personal curriculum. Technology will be a bit like gas or electricity or water. It will be a utility, but it'll be a really key one. We'll stop making things hard when we can make them simple. You know, so we will focus on my skills as a pupil and how you make me better use the technology to help me do that. And then, you know, put the publishers, and I see schools as publishers as well, working with the publishers. It's why this partnership with Hodder for us is so exciting, because we're getting to work with people who know how to produce high quality resource. What Hodder are getting, but I would say this is an opportunity to work with us, because we get how to get to kids. We get how to mediate this. We get how to harness technology to do it. So, but I think there'll be more of that. And what I really want, and this is a conversation Joysy and I had several times, is I want government to give schools, teachers, kids the agency to unlock that. And if you can do that by 2040, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland will have different education systems. And also, sorry, I've done ever so well to not be very political, but it is, I can't see the time actually, late, so I'm allowed to. The disjoint between those four countries is a nonsense. Because, you You know, we have disadvantaged youngsters in every community, in every city, in every town, in every country. So let's get together, create some architecture that allows people to build on each other's hard work and make sure that no kids are left behind. I never want to steal from the US. Kristen, apologies. But we've got kids who are left behind because we've fixed an experience that isn't for them. And the same for staff. So by 2040, James, much more personal, much more tech enabled, much more support for staff, much more architectural, so that actually you almost don't see the technology. Shouldn't need a department for EdTech in the DFE. There isn't one for electricity and gas and water. You know, so why do I need it? I need it because they don't value it. So start to value it. And actually by 2040, I can look at all you working really hard and see what an amazing job you've done and be very proud that perhaps I played some little part in it. Okay.
Yeah, and I think I'll just pick it up on some of the things in the chat. I mean, the point about sort of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is really well made. You know, it is increasingly different in those different regions, and that's something to be aware of. And I think that point about agency, but also permission. It feels like there's an opportunity here for the profession to get its profession back, and have both the agency and the permission without this sort of top down. You must do it like this. You must do it like this. And I'm sort of minded of one of the schools in the whole education network I was talking to yesterday. And they're down in the very southern tip of Cornwall, and they've spent the head teacher there spent most of the last 3 months fighting really hard with the DFE, because actually what they found during lockdown is some of their families and children have absolutely flourished outside of school, supported by devices and really high quality learning opportunities, and they've been fighting to get the attendance codes changed. And that picks up on something that somebody's written into the chat room. You know, children with SEND and ASD and ADD, and actually that how much calmer the environment is for them to learn at home. And I think, you know, that point about equity and getting that bit right is absolutely key within that notion of a carefully crafted curriculum. Chris, what about you through the lens of Microsoft? What does a Microsoft School of the Future look like? Is it still anytime, anywhere learning, sort of slightly rebadged, or
still from the year 2000? Yeah, I mean, I sort of a little bit like Mark, really. I kind of have a tension of I want to give an answer that's sort of very optimistic about the technology trends that we see and how they'll, you know, manifest in education, and then a little bit of me also would say that, you know, what we see being fairly mainstream in education today from an EdTech point of view was absolutely being done 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago, but it was only being done by a small group. And so I think that probably there's a reality somewhere in the middle where what is being seen as kind of really pushing the boundaries in some areas today will get cheaper and easier and simpler to do. And so will get much more broadly adopted. And I think, you know, from a kind of bringing that together with some of the tech trends, I think the role that data and AI will play in education will be transformational. And I think it has the potential, you know, one of the things that we're sort of talking about, and there's definitely a thread in the chat, is this is absolutely not a one size fits all. Of course, as soon as you try and do a whole class activity, it sort of becomes a one size fits all. And yet I think that the technology can play a role in being much more personalized learning and adapting and giving rapid feedback and helping people in different ways. And so I think that has a lot of maturing to do over the next couple of decades. I also think that we're starting to see mixed reality, virtual reality beginning to get more interesting. And I think the idea that can give students experiences that they're never going to experience in real life, and that could be historical experiences, it could be, you know, I was going to say space, maybe that is something they're going to experience here in their lifetime, but those sorts of environments that are not easy to access and or are dangerous to access, and yet kind of experiencing that way is a much more visceral learning experience, and blending that all together, I think will get really interesting. And then I was pleased that Mark touched on publishers and content. I think there's a lot of opportunity for, you know, how much content is produced by teachers every single day that is not really very different from each other. And so, like, how does that kind of content production, sharing, you know, validation and consumption, how much does that model change, and how you know, transformational that is in terms of the amount of time it takes to prepare and deliver content, you know. And so I think, you know, Kristen made a good point that the role of the teacher will almost certainly continue to adjust, but will become, like, no less important, if not more complex, to try and be the orchestrator of thinking about how do you get all of those things right for all of the needs of all of the different pupils that are at all of their different stages of learning and all of their requirements. But I think that's where kind of, if you think about the role that technology plays in other industries, it's taking away a lot of that kind of heavy work of manual intervention, and is instead letting people focus on the bits that really matter. And that would be, I suppose, kind of an ambition that technology is playing that role in education, and is letting the teachers play their best role, and letting technology do the bits that it can do well.
Yeah, and I think you sort of touched on that earlier on, Chris, around sort of teacher workload, and I made the point about the fact that our expectations of teachers and just the diversity of the roles that we expect them to be able to perform to a really high level. And I think there's a bit in the chat about let teachers be teachers, and I don't think anybody's arguing with that. We want our teachers to be teachers, but we might want to redefine exactly what we mean by them. Actually, which bits of what the adults in a classroom do are teaching. And which bits require the really high skill that all of the professionals who work in education bring to the table, supported by really great support staff in schools. But how can we really enable people to be successful at things that they're really good at and they've trained for, and let the publishers do the publishing bit. Let that access to the really high quality resources and those experiences that are harder to reach, let somebody else do that bit. I think is a sort of fundamental, a really sort of fundamental point. And again, come back to this idea of balance. It's nobody's advocating an extreme view of anything. It's let's get the balance of it right. And Joysy, if I come to you for your view, just to sort of finish the session off, what does a future school look like with sort of richly embedded hybrid learning? What does it look like for you?
So I'm going to go with an optimistic view that in the future we'll have three things. Firstly, everyone, especially the most marginalized and the vulnerable learners, will have quality education that's safe, relevant, and promotes social well-being. So they will not only gain literacy, numeracy, digital skills, but also social and emotional skills that is foundational for their future and their success. Secondly, I think there'll be a huge role played by technology and data to help parents, teachers, learners, school administrators get a better sense of what's happening and how to support the learners in their journey. And I think finally, we'll see a lot more collaboration and partnership. So, just as the partnership with publisher here, we'll see partnerships with businesses, with universities, with government and civil society to really help learners apply the knowledge that they're gaining to solve problems that the world faces. So I'll go with that optimistic view.
Optimistic and three sort of really, really clearly defined points. And I think that's probably almost bang on time. That's probably a sort of really good time to sort of bring it to a close. Has anybody got anything to add that they didn't want to, or they haven't had a chance to say but they wanted to? Okay, I'd like to sort of go to the chat room and say a huge thanks to everybody who's put things into the chat. I wasn't always able to keep my eye on that, but I know the panelists were able to. So hopefully we've picked up on some of the points that have been addressed. I think there are some other poll questions that we might not have got to, but they can be circulated by email in follow-up, because we would be interested in getting your feedback from those other poll questions. It sort of remains on me to extend a great sort of thanks to our amazing panel. So Chris, thank you very much. Joysy, thank you very much. Kristen, thank you. And Mark, thank you very much for your participation this afternoon. I'd like to thank you for being so kind with me. It's the first time I've facilitated this style of event, and I feel like I've survived, clinging onto the edge of the desk. So thank you very much. So thank you for everybody's contributions, everybody's thoughts. That's been a really interesting session. I would just like to sort of close out by reminding people about eduu.school, who sponsored this event. It will be opening its doors in the new year, but eduu.school want people to be involved. So, if you'd like to get involved, then please do. And eduu.school are opening 4 key stages for you to use for free, and welcome your involvement in shaping the service before it goes more broadly just after Christmas. So if that's something that you'd like to get involved in, then please do. Thank you once again for everybody on the panel. Thank you for everybody in the chat room. have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
James.
you.
James.
Thanks, James. Take care, everybody.